The game you are about to see is considered Carl Schlechter's immortal, as he sacrificed 2 rooks, 2 bishops and a knight to eventually checkmate his opponent. In the game, Schlechter brutally punishes his opponent for neglecting development. The game is also a perfect illustration of a creative and energetic attack and a bad defense. Schlechter's opponent, Fleissig, started with b4. This is the Polish opening or the Sokolski opening. The idea is to grab space on the queen side, usually by moving the pawn even further on b5 and preparing the fianchetto of the dark squared bishop. Schlechter plays e6, immediately attacking the pawn. Bishop b2, indirectly defending the pawn, because bishop takes b4 is impossible now, because g7 would fall in this case. That's why Schlechter plays knight f6 first, and now renewing the threat of capturing on b4. That's why white played a3, defending the pawn. However, this is too passive. Instead, it would have been better to keep playing in accordance with the main idea of this opening, namely b5, grabbing space on the queen side, controlling important squares and preventing the development of the knight on the active square c6, and if black tries to eliminate the pawn by playing a6, then a4, defending it, and the pawn will stay on b5 in this case. But white played passively a3, and Schlechter plays energetically c5, immediately attacking the pawn one more time, threatening to capture twice on b4 and win a pawn. That's why b5. And d5, so Schlechter completely occupied the center with his pawns. And now white made a serious mistake. White played d4, weakening his king. As you see, this diagonal is now weakened, and Schlechter immediately exploits this. Queen a5 check, and it turns out that it isn't just check. It's a double attack, and black is threatening to capture a very important pawn, which is limiting his queen side, his pieces. And the only way to save the pawn is knight c3, which was played. But now Schlechter completely seizes the initiative. Knight e4, attacking the pinned piece for the second time and threatening to capture on c3 and win a piece. That's why queen d3, defending it. But now c takes d, again attacking the pinned knight, that's why white must capture. But now bishop c5, a tempo move, developing the bishop with tempo, attacking the queen. And also, after the queen retreats, f2 will fall with check, but bishop c5 actually left g7 pawn unguarded, and white captured on g7. And bishop takes f2, check followed, king d1. So now white king is bound to stay in the center of the board. But what to do next? The rook is under attack. Of course, black can make a prosaic move and play rook f8, saving the rook. And black will have advantage, a very serious advantage in this case, maybe even a winning advantage. However, Schlechter played this game in a romantic style, and he found a much more beautiful and creative idea instead of simple and ordinary rook f8. You can pause the video and try to find his great move. So, he leaves the rook unguarded and starts a deadly attack. d4, attacking the knight. It turns out that the knight cannot move. For example, if knight takes e4, then simply checkmate on e1 would follow. So the knight cannot move. d4 also breaks the communication between the queen and the knight, so the knight will fall in this case. However, the rook is under attack, so of course white captures the rook with check. And now Schlechter made another strong move. King e7, leaving the bishop unguarded. So he didn't want to play king d7, which would defend the bishop, because on d7 the king is taking the square from the knight. Now the knight cannot move anywhere. And also the king is blocking the bishop's diagonal. So both of these pieces, and that's why also for this reason the rook too, because the rook can develop only after the development of the bishop and the knight. So these pieces wouldn't be able to move. So the whole queen side would be paralyzed in this case. That's why king e7, leaving the bishop unguarded. And white captures the bishop too. And this turns out to be a serious mistake. So it's not a good idea to accept all the sacrifices when your pieces aren't developed, and when your king is still in the center, and it will stay in the center. So instead of queen takes c8, it would have been much better to make either a move suggested by a computer. Of course, Fleissig couldn't have found it. Knight h3, developing the knight, attacking the bishop, very important bishop, which creates checkmating threats together with the queen. Or a human move, knight f3. So development is very important, knight f3. In this case, knight takes c3 could have followed, bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, attacking the rook, rook b1, and bishop e3, for example, creating checkmating threats. So now the knight cannot move, blocking the e2 pawn, it cannot move. That's why the bishop also, its development is problematic, and that's why the rook's development is problematic. The king will stay in the center. White is on exchange up. However, black has a great compensation for the exchange. Next move, of course, queen is also defending the bishop. So next move, black will play knight d7, then knight b6, knight c4, creating terrible threats and most probably win. However, still the victory wouldn't have been so easy, so white could have continued the resistance. But after queen takes c8, white is much worse now. So Schlechter captures on c3 and is threatening to capture the bishop too. That's why bishop c1. Instead of bishop c1, queen takes b7 check, loses on the spot because of simple king f6. And now if queen takes a8, then of course c takes b, and black is threatening the promotion to the queen, and also queen e1 checkmate. So two checkmates, and white cannot parry both threats. Or instead of queen takes a8, if a better move, queen takes e4, because the rook isn't doing anything, but the knight was very dangerous in the center, and the queen is centralized in this case. However, still it doesn't help because of the same c takes b with two threats, checkmate, checkmate, and white can only give a couple of checks, but it's not a perpetual, of course, because the black king easily escapes the checks. That's why after d takes c, bishop c1 followed, returning to the initial square. So all white pieces are placed on the initial squares, only the queen is playing. And now another strong move in accordance with all the rules of romantic chess. Knight d7. The development is very important. It's much more important than the materia. So the second rook is also sacrificed. And white again accepts the sacrifice and captures on a8. Instead of this, it would have been better to capture on b7. White is still losing, however, it would be more difficult for black to win. In this case, rook d8 would have followed with a terrible x-ray, and after queen takes e4, knight e5 check, queen d3, white is losing the queen, and simply, for example, bishop takes g1, rook takes g1, rook takes, e takes, queen b6 with tempo attacking the rook. And after rook h1, knight g4, threatening a fork, and there is nothing white can do in this position. For example, if king e1, then simply checkmate in a few moves would have followed in this case. And there is no way white can defend from checkmate in one. But still, it would have been better, because black would have had to find all these variations. But white captures on a8, and now the queen is completely out of play in the corner. So all white pieces are on the initial squares, the queen is out of play, and the king is bound to be in the center. And all black pieces are extremely active, and this pawn is also very strong. It can be counted also as a piece. So now queen takes b5. Of course, not to win a pawn, but on a5 the queen wasn't doing anything. The idea is, of course, to create a deadly threat. Queen d5 check, followed by checkmate. So now the queen comes into play with great effect. What to do now? So white played bishop f4. Instead of bishop f4, for example, knight f3 doesn't help either because of queen d5 check, bishop d2, c takes d, threatening checkmate in one move, and after c4, vacating the c2 square doesn't help either, knight c3 check, and for example in this variation, white is checkmated. After queen c1, no matter where the king goes, it's checkmated. For example, if king b4, then checkmate in a few moves would follow this. But white played bishop f4. And, of course, queen d5 check followed. And after king c1, Schlechter found a brilliant continuation. Black actually has a forced checkmate here. So after black's next move, checkmate in a few moves will follow in a forced way. You can pause the video and try to find Schlechter's brilliant move. So now it's time to sacrifice the bishop. Bishop e3 check. The idea is to vacate the f2 square for the knight. There is nothing white can do except accepting the sacrifice, because king b1 will be followed by checkmate in 2 moves, followed by queen b2 checkmate. That's why bishop takes e3. And now f2 square is vacated for the knight and knight f2 follows. The idea is to create a checkmate threat on d1. And there is no way white can defend. White again must accept the sacrifice of the knight for the same reason. King b1 doesn't help because of queen b5 check followed by checkmate on b2. That's why after knight f2, white actually resigned, because after bishop takes f2, the bishop moved from e3, it isn't controlling d2 square anymore, and queen d2 check would have followed, and followed by checkmate in 2 moves. Hit the like button as it's really helpful for the channel growth, and subscribe. See you in next videos.